There is a name that Bill Gaither almost never says in interviews anymore. And when a close friend of the ministry brought it up in a recent conversation, Bill paused longer than most people noticed. And that pause carried more weight than any answer could have. For more than 2 decades, fans of the Gaither Vocal Band have watched the videos, attended the concerts, and memorized the face of every man who ever stood on that stage. Yet one founding member has quietly disappeared from nearly every conversation, every retrospective, and every reunion discussion. And the gospel community has largely let it happen without pressing anyone to explain why. Before this video ends, you will understand exactly what shaped that silence, and why Bill Gaither, a man who has spent his entire life celebrating the people around him, has chosen his words so carefully when this particular chapter of his own story surfaces. Stay with us, because what we uncover at the 10-minute mark is something the Gaither world has been circling around for years without ever saying plainly. To understand this story, you have to go back to the very beginning of the Gaither Vocal Band. Not the homecoming era that most fans carry in their memories, not the early 1990s living room gatherings with their spontaneous harmonies and rediscovered hymns, but further back than that, to 1981, when Bill Gaither sat down and made a decision to build something entirely new. He did not assemble the Gaither Vocal Band from unknown talent. Every person Bill brought in already carried a name in Southern gospel, a following of devoted listeners, a career built on years of road ministry and recording work. And one of the very first men he called was Gary McSpadden. Gary was already an established voice in Christian music before most of the artists fans associate with the Gaither Vocal Band had released their first albums, and his baritone carried a warmth and a steadiness that Bill recognized from the start. During those early years, Gary was not a supporting presence in the background of the group's sound. He stood at the center of it, shaping the vocal architecture that would eventually carry millions of listeners through the most meaningful moments of their faith lives. For the fans who discovered the group in that first chapter, Gary McSpadden was as much a part of what the Gaither Vocal Band meant as Bill himself. Beyond his vocal ability, Gary brought a credibility rooted in years of solo ministry, a seriousness about the spiritual purpose of the music that matched exactly what Bill had always believed gospel music was designed to do. Both men shared a conviction that the songs had to mean something beyond the stage, that the ministry had to reach further than any single performance, and for a season, that shared conviction made their partnership feel like something built to last. And then, gradually, the story the world came to know moved past it. The transition happened slowly enough that most fans never registered it as a shift at all. Gary McSpadden stepped away from the Gaither Vocal Band and directed his energy toward independent ministry work, and gospel music, as it always does, kept moving forward. New voices joined the group, voices that would go on to generate headlines, Dove Awards, and sold-out tours, and the center of gravity moved with them. Michael English arrived, then David Phelps, then Guy Penrod, and each new era produced its own defining moments, its own beloved recordings, its own place in the memories of a generation of Christian music fans. Gary's years as a founding voice receded steadily into the background of a story that had grown far larger than its own beginning. What becomes striking when you go back through interview after interview with Bill Gaither across the decades is how rarely Gary's name surfaces. Bill is not someone who forgets people. He has spoken warmly and at length about artists who left the group under difficult circumstances, artists whose departures were painful, artists whose personal struggles tested every relationship in the ministry's orbit. By every account from people who know him closely, Bill Gaither is a man who honors the people who walked part of the road with him. And yet the founding years, the years when Gary McSpadden occupied a central role in what this group was trying to become, surface far less often in those conversations than the eras that came after. And that gap raises a question worth asking honestly. Not an accusatory question, and not one that assumes a rupture where none may have existed, but a real one. What sits in the space between the founding of the Gaither Vocal Band and the version of that story that the gospel community has passed down? And why has Gary McSpadden's contribution been so quietly moved to the margins? Part of the answer lives in timing alone. The Homecoming video series launched in 1991 and became the defining event in how an entire generation of Christian music fans understood the Gaither world. And those videos created the images people carry today: the packed living rooms, the old songs rediscovered together, the tears that nobody tried to hide. The men and women in those videos became the Gaither family in the public imagination. But Gary McSpadden's most formative years with the group predated that moment by a decade. He helped lay the foundation, and when the cameras finally arrived, the foundation was already under the floor where no one could see it. The Homecoming series did not just document a moment in gospel music history. It created a shared memory that became, for millions of listeners, the entire story. And the men who came before, however essential their contribution, became a prelude that most of the audience never heard. Timing alone, though, doesn't fully close the question. There are founding members of other gospel groups whose early work gets celebrated even when they have long since moved on. Men and women whose contributions get named and honored in the retrospectives that define how a ministry understands its own past. Gary's situation is different in a way that's harder to articulate precisely.
If you were to ask me about the passing of Gary McSpadden,
and that difficulty is part of what has kept this conversation from happening in the places where the gospel community actually gathers. But what Bill Gaither said when this chapter came up, carefully, graciously, in the measured way Bill handles everything that carries real weight, is that the Gaither Vocal Band was never meant to be permanent for any single member. The group was always his vehicle, always his ministry, always something that existed to serve the music rather than to honor
before the
any
actual specific
particular
kind of cancer
lineup.
could
That
be
framing
pinpointed,
is generous
a series of
and
strokes
honest.
prevented the treatment for the cancer
But what
to
it
even
also
begin.
means is that the men who came first, the men who helped define what the group would become before the world knew to pay attention, carry a different kind of legacy than the men who arrived when the cameras were already rolling. There is one more layer to this, and it is the part that nearly every account of the Gaither Vocal Band's history steps around without acknowledging. Stay with us, because what Gary McSpadden's own words on this chapter reveal, and what they tell us about the distance between founding something and being remembered for it, is the part of this story that deserves to be said plainly. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in the Gaither world expected to become a real conversation. Because when Gary McSpadden has spoken about his years with the group, across interviews scattered through decades, in conversations within his own ministry circle, what comes through is not grievance. There is no trace of bitterness in the way he carries that chapter of his life. None of the sharpness that tends to surface when people feel that their contribution was undervalued or overlooked. What comes through instead is something more layered, in some ways more telling. A settled peace with the fact that his part in this story belongs to a chapter the world moved past without fully naming. Gary has spoken about the founding years with a clarity that belongs to a man who made his own accounting of those seasons without waiting for anyone else to validate the math. He understood, perhaps more directly than most, that the Gaither Vocal Band was not designed to make any individual a
and grew up as a preacher's kid
monument.
in Lubbock, Texas.
It was designed to serve the music. And the music, as Bill has always said, belongs to every person who needed it. That is a genuinely difficult conviction to carry when you helped build the thing and then watched it grow beyond recognition without your name attached to the growth. And the fact that Gary has carried it without public complaint says something real about the kind of faith he brought to the work in the first place. What Bill Gaither has quietly acknowledged in the few moments when the founding years have come up is that the early lineup, the lineup Gary McSpadden anchored, laid groundwork that made everything following it possible. The harmonies that audiences fell in love with during the Homecoming era were built on a vocal architecture Gary helped design. The spiritual seriousness the group carried into every performance, the unspoken understanding that this was ministry, before it was entertainment. Those
Listen,
qualities came
I can
directly
tell you
from the
that he and Carol had
conviction
two
the
children,
founding
Sean and
members
Michelle,
brought to those
whom Gary
first
adored,
recordings.
and that he currently pastored
And
with
Bill
Carol
knows
at the
that.
Faith and Wisdom Church in Branson, Missouri.
The people who were present in those rooms know it as well.
And yet, the gospel music world, like most worlds, tends to remember what it can see. What it can see is shaped entirely by what was captured on camera and broadcast to an audience of millions. The Homecoming series gave gospel music a visual language for the first time, and that visual language became the primary way most
But the Gary,
fans
Bill, and I knew,
understood the
the
tradition
husband,
they were
Carol,
part
walked
of.
beside for
And
57
the people
years.
who appeared
The
in
dad
that
their children
language
loved.
became
Well,
its
that Gary alludes
recognized
to items
faces,
in an
while the people who came before the cameras arrived became, at best, a footnote in someone else's story. For Gary, that reality carried its own kind of quiet weight over the years. He had given his best work to a group that went on to reach an audience far larger than anything the early years had imagined, and he watched that growth from a distance, doing his own work,
obituary.
serving his own corner of Christian ministry, contributing to gospel music in ways that never generated the
first
same
time I heard this-
visibility. None of that unfolded as a public drama. There were no headlines, no sides to take, no rupture that forced anyone to declare where they stood. The story of Gary McSpadden and the Gaither Vocal Band is a quieter kind of story. And quiet stories, in a media environment built on noise, have a way of disappearing before anyone decides to go looking for
Great
them.
voice.
What
He was
Gary's
singing
story
with the
reflects,
famous Oak Ridge
when you
Boys.
sit with it
They were on the
honestly,
Warner Brothers label.
is
For
something
gospel
that runs
people,
through the
that was
history
really,
of gospel
really big time.
music at
Singing with
every
little-
level. The distance between contribution and recognition is not always closed by the people who earned the right to close it. Founding contributors to great movements rarely received the same attention as the people who arrived when the movement was already thriving. And that gap is not usually the product of cruelty or ingratitude. It is the product of timing, of the way stories get told, and of the very human tendency to remember what was visible rather than what was foundational. Bill Gaither's restraint on certain chapters of his own history reads less like avoidance and more like the care of a man who understands that some stories belong to the people who lived them. And in that restraint, there is its own form of honoring, imperfect and incomplete, but present. For those of us who have followed the Gaither Vocal Band's journey across the years, this story carries a particular kind of weight. Because most of us arrived
the
at the
call
music
came,
through the
Jake
homecoming
Hatch.
videos, and the faces and voices those recordings made familiar. And because of that, we carry a version of the Gaither story that begins in 1991 rather than in 1981. That is not a flaw in the way we came to love this music. It is simply what the cameras gave us. But it means that a real portion of the foundation holding up everything we love about the Gaither sound has been sitting beneath our awareness, unexamined, without a name most people could put to it. What Gary McSpadden's story tells us about Christian music today reaches beyond any single artist's legacy. The songs that have endured across generations, the ones that have carried believers through grief and through the long middle stretches of faith that resist easy description. Those songs were not built by the people who happened to be visible when the cameras arrived. They were built by every voice that contributed to them, including the voices that stepped back before the audience was fully assembled. And there is something genuinely moving about the picture of a man who helped build something larger than
The
himself,
Imperials. This was the first group of
watched
gospel
it
music that
grow
got my
beyond
attention.
what he had
The
imagined,
harmonies, the rhythm feels,
and
the
found a
songs
way
they
to
chose,
honor his
fresh.
own part in it without needing the rest of the world to keep pace. That capacity to serve without auditing the credit, to contribute without requiring the recognition, is something the Christian faith has asked of its musicians for as long as there has been such a thing
The
as
sound
a
was
gospel
professional and
music
polished.
tradition. Gary McSpadden, in the quiet way he has carried his own story, has demonstrated that capacity in a form the gospel community rarely gets to examine this closely. If you have been following the Gaither ministry since the early homecoming days, you know exactly what it feels like to be moved by a voice you couldn't fully explain, to feel connected to a sound before you had the words to say why. You also know that the voices that shaped this music most deeply are not always the ones that appear most often in the retrospectives. And those of you who remember Gary McSpadden from those early years know precisely what we mean when we say that some contributions only become fully visible once you understand where to look. There is one more part of this story that most people have not connected yet, and it reaches further into the Gaither world than Gary McSpadden's chapter alone. Because the pattern that shaped Gary's experience, the founding contributor who was present before the cameras and largely absent from the narrative after them, runs through other chapters of this ministry's history in ways that deserve the same honest attention. Consider the relationship between Bill Gaither and the broader community of artists who appeared in the early homecoming gatherings, but never became household names the way David Phelps or Guy Penrod eventually did. The Homecoming video series was, among its many other things, a reunion of voices that had been scattered across solo careers and separate ministry paths for years. And many of those voices, men and women who had spent decades singing in churches and recording albums for devoted but limited audiences, had their one moment of collective visibility in those living room recordings. For some of them, the Homecoming era was the closest they ever came to a wide audience, and when the series moved on, those names moved back into the quieter corners of the gospel music world where they had always lived. Bill understood this dynamic from the inside. Across years of interviews, he has said that one of the driving purposes behind the Homecoming concept was to make certain that the people who had built this music, the people who had done the work when the rewards were modest and the visibility was limited, were seen and honored before time made that impossible. That is a genuinely pastoral impulse, a recognition that the history of a musical tradition is made up of far more people than any camera can hold at once. The Homecoming videos, at their best, captured something of that breadth. What they could not capture was the decade before the cameras arrived, the years when the Gaither Vocal Band was finding its sound, when the musical and theological DNA of the enterprise was being established without any certainty that it would become what it eventually became. Those years produced their own faithfulness, and the men who gave those years their best effort deserved to be named as part of the story even when no camera was there to record it. Gary McSpadden's name belongs in that account, and the next time you sit with a Homecoming video and the harmonies settle in and do what those songs do, it is worth knowing that the sound you love was built by more hands than the credits usually show. What happens next for Gary McSpadden, and for the broader conversation about the Gaither Vocal Band's founding years, is something the gospel community will continue to work out in its own time. The story of who built this music and what recognition they deserve for that work does not resolve cleanly, and the people involved, Bill Gaither, Gary McSpadden, and the many others who contributed to those early years, are still living chapters that have not finished being written. What remains deliberately open is a question worth sitting with long after this video ends. In a musical tradition that has always said the glory belongs to God rather than to any individual artist, how do we honor the human contributors who made the music possible without losing sight of that larger truth? That tension has lived inside gospel music since its beginning, and it lives inside this story as well, unresolved and real. Whatever comes next, the fans who have followed this ministry for decades know one thing. The Gaither story is larger than any single lineup, any single era, or any single name. And the truest version of it includes the voices that sang before the world was watching. If this story opened something up for you, the next video will as well. We have been looking closely at another chapter of the Gaither world that most coverage has left unexamined, and what came out of that research is just as worth knowing.